Hello, everyone. Hello in the weird and wild, wonderful world of the architecture online. I'm Stephen Drew from the Architecture Social, and I am back in the fold. I am back. I know I've been away. I've been a little bit busy, but I'm never going to stay away for too long. And just while I'm starting the adventure, I'm here with a real podcast host, but this time it's going to be sitting in the driver's seat, and there's going to be two parts to this episode. There's going to be the one where I get critiqued on my podcast setup, and I haven't shown Rion any of this, and then we're going to go deep and meaningful into bottlenecks and lower fees and all
the fee squeeze.
The fee squeeze, exactly. Fee squeeze. Isn't that a brilliant thing? With the fantastic Rion Willard. Rion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
The virtual audience.
I'm loving these sound effects.
Do you? Okay.
Fabulous.
Well, that's a nice segue. So I downloaded a few sounds. So I've got the fake audience here.
Very nice. Very nice.
They make all noises. And then I've got like electronic dance music and crazy stuff. So when you really want to knock it up a level, we're getting going. So I've got that. But right, okay, I've got to keep this professional. But just before we do that, I've got a few other things as well.
Don't keep it professional on my part.
No, well, it's more for the wider audience. I wouldn't want to lose.
All right, okay.
I wouldn't want to let everyone down now. And I am a member of the Reba Council, so I have to keep these. They're all my views. They're all my views, Reba. They're all my views. And so, we've got to start off with a bit of a David Brent dance, So I got that. I thought I'd get a few memes in there. And I have an architecture meme here as well. So I found, did anyone know that Frank Gehry was actually on The Simpsons? And so I've got my memes, I've got my dances, and that was what I thought I'd get critiqued on. As well as that, I got backgrounds and stuff, so you can get a nice background, we can get a nice bit of colors. So I've gone all out for you, Rion. How are you feeling, though?
I'm loved.
You're feeling loved.
And like a warm sense of nostalgia. As I was saying to you earlier, I feel like, it's brought me back to my childhood, early Saturday mornings when I'd watch Going Live. Yeah. And I aspired to be on that show. And
this is it. Well, we are on LinkedIn. We are in the audience. Just a reminder for anyone watching, you can drop a comment at any point and we can choose to bring it up on the big screen. So if during this you have a question for Rion or myself, you can ask us and we can potentially.
So have you ever worked in radio, Stephen?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah, you think so?
I think you'd be fantastic.
Well, you haven't heard my questions yet, so I've got to do that first, haven't I? Okay, so the topic, as we discussed in the emails, which I loved, easy squeezy, lemon peasy, the fees being squeezed in architecture.
The fee squeeze, yeah.
Yeah. So we were at an interesting time. So just before we spoke and got ready to go live here, it's an interesting time because ARB has just been coming out talking about maybe changing the education system as well. It's from changing the old school part 1, part 2. I'm a part 2. That'd be nice if ARB changes so I can be an architect. I wouldn't mind that. But maybe that will affect the businesses. Maybe that's going to have a knock-on effect on everything. And ARB are looking at as well international architects and how, if you're an international qualified architect, how you can actually make it easier to, be an architect, registered architect in the UK. Because you can do all these years overseas, but it's been quite arduous sometimes to get that.
But it's kind of ridiculous that there isn't more fluidity internationally between architectural qualifications. I mean, architecture isn't. I mean, we get really, I see this a lot in, say, the larger big practices like your Grimshaws and your RSPs, and these are big practices with massive amounts of international architects in the first place. Yeah. And their education is, it's all of a high standard, particularly in Europe and Australia, the US. Yeah. And for architects, and they might remain in a big practice for 10 years, and just because they're qualified elsewhere, they're not allowed to call themselves an architect. And then you get to the situation where they're saying, they call themselves architect registered in the Netherlands, or architect registered in Italy, or whatever it is, because they can't use the word. And it seems a bit pointless, really. And particularly with the kind of digital global world that we're living in, and the ability to be able to work remotely. The States is even worse, because you're not qualified state to state. So once you leave New York State, for example, you're no longer qualified in New Jersey.
Man, yeah. Well, I think you're right. Now, I was talking about all the memes and stuff at the start. That was a poor introduction on my presenter behalf. So, Rion, as well as doing the Business of Architecture podcast, you actually run your own architecture practice, and I think that's important for everyone to understand. So, this is your URL below, right?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so we'll keep that up for a bit, because that's a bit of context for our viewers here, because what's important is, while you do the podcast, you do run your own architecture practice. I do.
But to be honest with you, I don't do that much architecture these days.
Interesting.
So architecture is more like a nice paid hobby for me these days.
Right.
I have a couple of projects on, but the business of architecture has grown into a full-blown, it is a business consultancy. So Enoch Sears and myself, I don't know if you know Enoch in the US. So him and I, we kind of joined forces, if you like, and now the majority of my time is spent as a full-time business consultant. We've got clients all over the world, from the US, from the UK, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. And that's what most of my time is spent doing these days, which is amazing.
Interesting. That's interesting.
Which has been a result of the podcasts, and then Enoch and I kind of coming together. Enoch and I we've been collaborating since, I don't know, 2014, 2015, something like that. Yeah. And then over the last 12 months, I've got more and more involved with there you go.
Here we go. We'll have I forgot to say, we can browse around on this format, isn't it? So
absolutely. I mean, if you go to the Smart Practice Method, that's
okay. I'll go back.
That's our main our program, essentially.
Very cool.
That we've launched for architects. So we've got about 50 odd clients at the moment.
Amazing. So that's interesting. So as well as practicing architecture, and you do a bit less of it, you're involved with a lot of architecture practices as well.
Yes.
So especially when we're talking about bottlenecks, and we're talking about the fees being squeezed, that's a bit of a tongue twister. But when we're talking about that, you see it on a lot of your clients as well. So I think that's important for the viewers to mention. So you've got your own practice, but then you also see how people are affected. And let's freestyle on that a bit. So I've forgotten almost how I get rid of this. There you go. Yeah, there you go. It's been a little while. So tell us a bit about what's your thoughts at the moment, because I do notice a fee squeeze. And when I especially was in recruitment, and when I saw companies in particular, sometimes it was a case of having offices which are not based in the UK as a way to outsource work and then get the fees lower. I almost felt it was like a race to the bottom, if that makes sense, when you've got architecture practices competing to lower the fees.
It's bonkers. And I mean, a lot of it is there's lots of different reasons why it's happening. One part of it, particularly when we look at public and institutional work, and even with commercial clients and developers, they'll be, essentially they're often coming to the architects too late in the process anyway, right? So they've done a lot of their initial appraisals and works, and then they're basically looking for someone to fit a very constrained box of here's the service that we want and require. So we need you to do this. And they've kind of done that in order to squeeze the fees. In public procurement, there's often a project manager or somebody whose sole job is to make sure that the architect fees are as low as possible. Right? So developers do this as well, and it very much commoditizes what architectural services are. And then architects, we are responsible for our own fee squeeze. We are responsible for it. We have been creating it. The lack of business acumen and knowledge, or even the paradigm of framing architecture as a service, particularly in our education, that conversation needs to be integrated more. And for us to be more aware that actually we are operating in a commercial and service-based industry, and often we don't want to be. And if we're unable to kind of deal with that as a fact and celebrate it, it leaves us vulnerable to not having, for not learning about negotiations, to not learning about marketing, to not learning about, how to get premium fees, not knowing how to, put someone through a sales process. And what we end up doing is we're mimicking often what we've been, the kind of culture that we've picked up at university, which is, kind of work hard. Let me do more work. Let me show you what I can do. The portfolio culture, the crit culture. I mean, again, that has its place. I'm not saying that's not, that these are bad things. It's just that you can't forget, as an architect, we do spend a prolonged period of, of gestation, if you like, learning how to become an architect and all the skills around it. And there's a certain culture around there which negates the business context and the financial context and the economic context. So when we go into, setting up our own businesses, it's very rare that anybody's got any business skills or have learned about it. And then we're going straight into negotiating with typically highly sophisticated, financially literate clients who negotiate hard. And they know they have strategies to make sure that their suppliers give them cheap goods, and architects are very vulnerable to it. And then we find ourselves, the thing I hear from architects so often is just giving away free work. At all scales of practice. I've interviewed large practices, they give away free work. Small practices, they're giving away free work. Then we go into looking at, lots of students who will be coming out of university and they're setting up their own little freelance businesses, and they are undercut, other practices. And it's like, okay, well, then that has an impact as well, because if you're going to be undercutting lots of larger practices, don't be surprised when you're getting a job and your salary is low. It all starts to have this kind of impact, if you like, right? So the free work, that's a real, that just as an industry just has got to stop. You wouldn't consider lawyers doing this kind of stuff, right? They give away pro bono work, but architects are convinced, much of the time, that let me just wow them with this piece of work. A site plan comes in, and us as architects, we love design, we love architecture, we want to get creative. Our creative brains and juices are just flowing. We're already designing the project. Let me get at it. Let me just do this one little thing. And that kind of culture of let me wow them with the design, then we'll win the project, we'll win the work. And that's like, from a marketing and sales perspective, it's like, no, that's kind of not the principles behind it. Like, being able to articulate and understand what the client's problem is first. This is professional selling. That's more like down the line of what professional sales is, and being able to articulate and understand and elicit the emotions or the pains behind why a client is doing something, and meeting them in the conversation that they're having in their own minds now. So that's that's how, being skilled in being able to do that, that's where we start to be able to create value. And also architects are really reactive as an industry. We're reactive in terms of how we win work. So we wait for it to come, or we kind of get very dependent just purely on referrals, and we don't necessarily have a system for setting up referrals, or we're reluctant to be stirring the pot of existing clients. There's not much proactive going after, this is the kind of clients we want to have, these are the people that we should be speaking to, and actually putting that into a discipline in a business where you're spending 25% of your time going after the work and the clients that you want to. So as I was saying before, at the beginning, developers and public institutions, sometimes when they go to a public tender for work, they've already made loads of decisions about the project. They've
Right.
already made loads of decisions about how it's going to operate, and then they've got a budget in mind, which has kind of just come from somewhere. And really, architects create way more value earlier on in the process. So this is opportunity for us to start being creative and approaching dialogues with clients much earlier on, looking at different types of business models. Perhaps there are sorts of kind of retainer fees that you can get on as an advisory, or being a consultant first with these types of with these sorts of projects where you're helping them develop a long-lasting vision, etc., which then lays a much more powerful foundation to be able to negotiate value, right? And not get into this position of having fees just being squeezed. The other part of this as well is that if we end up taking on projects where the fees are too low, and then we do that because we might at some level feel desperate, or we're kind of deluding ourselves of what the project actually is. This is the other thing. So we'll take on a project, and I see it a lot where architects will take on a project. It's a humble brief, let's say, but then as an industry, we want to turn that brief into something extraordinary. And it's kind of, and now we're in the process of over delivering. And we're turning a very humble brief. It doesn't mean you can't do good work, but now you've got 3 people working on this small project full time. Your fees have just been eaten away. The client, they're happy, great, but it wasn't necessarily what they were asking for. And now the project has turned into the Guggenheim. And I'm over exaggerating a little bit here, but
that's all right. This is the place where you can do that. It right? Resonates a lot with me on what you're saying on so many levels. And so, from speaking from a purely recruitment point of view, when the fees are lower, it has a knock-on effect from everything. So what I've seen is that when the fees are lower, there's less money to go around on the pot. And as you say, a project is quite unwielding. It requires a lot of work. What naturally happens is that you don't have the financial resources for people to do on it. So what do you have to do? You're then kind of in this position where you're asking your current staff to work overtime. And then what really happens there, Rion, is that maybe they can do that for a bit, but they start getting exhausted. They start getting fatigued. And then where I think the businesses forget what happens is that if that 1 or 2 of these members of staff, which have been overworked, leave, then you can kind of accrue a cost because you might have to pay a recruitment consultant, or you don't have people available, or you have to pull people from other projects. So basically, it's kind of like this downward spiral. The other bit that you mentioned, which I really do resonate on it, and you're right, it's really hard, isn't it? Because you're thinking of when you're trained as an architect, in terms of negotiation, in terms of selling, to talk about fees, and that's where I'm sympathetic. It is extremely intimidating speaking to a developer when they say, well, this practice I've just spoken to is going to do it for 0.5% less, Rion. So what are you going to do about it? And that's where, as an industry, the other bit of the problem is. And what I've learned in terms of my business is that there's 2 things recently, and I'll tell you one of my current things, right? And this happens to me all the time. So this is current now that I've learned, is that because I do try to give away a lot of information on the architecture social. I do it because, but what I've learned to do now is I try to give my free content in vehicles like this, which can be used by the masses, and there's a gain from it, okay? Because in this piece of recording, the point is people can access it and it can be used. However, what sometimes I get is I get a message come to me, and it'll be a really nice person with no bad intentions, but they'll be saying, Steve, I've got this big problem at the moment. They'd send me a big email and saying, can you give me half an hour to an hour of your time? And I have to be really upfront with them and say, I can if you pay me. And what I've learned at the moment is that usually that person will then never message me again, because they were looking for a free answer. And I
Mhm.
think that almost sounds cruel, but I have to be really astute as a professional, because the architecture social costs money. My time is, I have to spend it on places which I have a maximum yield, such as this, or on things which I can bill to keep the architecture social going. And I think that when you're talking about giving away free works, it's really tempting to do that in an architectural practice, free feasibility study or pitching for a work, and you spend a lot of time on it and nothing comes back. And where that can hurt you as a business is that then from that, you're not turning over so much profit. You can't give your staff pay rises. You can't spend the time and energy on free stuff that you want to do. And you kind of put yourself into a box. But what my point, Rion, to end this kind of like tangent, is that you have to be okay saying no. And I do think that what I've learned is that actually by sticking with your fees, so especially in recruitment, I'd have some companies ask for a lower fee, and there's a big power in saying no. And
Yeah.
and once the client tests you on it, and you say, well, my fee is because of X, Y, Z, it's because of my background, you get me, it's my experience, and I want to do it the right way, and you go through that with them, usually I think they come around because you're the first person that said no to them, whereas a lot of companies bend over backwards. And actually, my impression is that when you're speaking to directors, even though it's scary, whether it's a development director or an architect director, they will respect you if you challenge or make them think on a point where your intentions are, for instance, they're good intentions. And what I mean by this in an architectural context is because you want the design to be good, or you can just see the problems coming down the road. And it's actually okay to navigate those tricky points with the client at the start.
Yeah,
but it's far too
absolutely.
tempting to say no, isn't it? I'd say it's far too tempting to say, yeah, I will do that, and no, it's no problem. And then what happens is for the next year, you're in a stressful situation.
Yeah, no, exactly. Every time you say yes to a project at a lower fees, you're saying no to 1,000 other things that you could have been doing that would have been a better fit. And really, the sales conversation is all about you qualifying the clients to make sure that they're the right fit for you. And when we train our clients in sales, one of the first sort of parts of the conversation, well, first of all, we move away from using proposals, right? Because proposals and proposal writing and doing long, lengthy email negotiating emails, that's mental. Like, speak about it, talk about it with people. Right. You listen to how property developers do so many of their deals. I've spoken with many very, very successful property developers who are still doing their contracts and deals on a handshake. Right. And so that, there's, and this is not to say that we don't have like our terms and conditions signed off and done, but I'm talking about the difference between a proposal and an agreement.
Right, got you.
Right. So you're getting to an agreement and a handshake. Okay, great. And then you can follow up with a proposal of all the breakdowns of here's the deliverables and here's the, here's your standard form of agreement of the RIBA or your appointment contract from the AIA or whatever it is. But you can come to these terms, you can come to the agreement face to face.
Yeah.
And particularly when in a sales conversation, we have a thing called the permission step, which is one of the very first parts of a conversation, where you deliberately invite all the objections up front.
Good.
Right.
I like that.
So you start talking about them. Like you might say something along the lines of, there are two reasons why some people may choose not to do business with us. Number one, we're expensive. Number two, we charge 50% of our fees, all of it up front. Are either of these going to be a problem?
Can you do that? Yeah, I love it. Exactly. Are you
sure
you want to do that?
Yeah.
And it's
and exactly. And then what happens is do you still want to continue this conversation?
Yeah,
well, what do you mean? What do you mean by expensive? What does that mean? Well, I don't know how much your project is going to cost at right now, but typically we charge a premium rate for it. Okay. Yeah. And then you can have a proper adult conversation about fees. You can start questioning them about what their budget is. Where do they, how do they arrive at that budget? What they've done this type of project before, so that's where they got those fees from. How are they going to be paying for it? Have they got the finance ready? Are they using a mortgage? Are they using that? You're allowed to ask all these questions, and the client appreciates it, because now you're having a, you know,
Yeah, a proper conversation.
yeah, you're having
It's
a proper conversation about a project, about
yeah,
what's happening.
yeah.
And so you can, you can get creative and structure your fees like that, and you can just be, I'm not gonna buckle. But the way that we typically sell as architects, and this is not just architects, this is all sorts of businesses and people who have been trained in the profession, and they just start a business and they've never had any business training whatsoever. Then this is what we do. We try and convince and persuade, and and sell, and do the dog and pony show of, like, let me show, and architects will do what they know, what they can do well, which is design. So let me show you beautiful designs, and then that's what the client wants. The reality of it is that the clients typically, they're not as interested in design as we are. Right? Some are. Don't get me wrong, but the way they perceive it, they're not as sold on it as we are. And what's really interesting, when I have clients who move from architecture into development, and then they hire an architect, and even though they are architects themselves, hiring another architect, and they're obsessed with design, and the architects are obsessed with the design, there's often that kind of a friction what happens in the selling, because the architect doing the selling is now, kind of just obsessed with the design, and the person who's putting up the money has got a whole lot of other concerns which are not being discussed. And that's what's really worrying them. So it takes a little bit of, again, just there's a mindset to sales and marketing of getting inside of the head of the client and where they actually are at now, what their problems are, being able to articulate their problems in a sophisticated manner, being able to elicit emotion in terms of understanding what are the real drivers for a project, being able to ask uncomfortable questions and talk about fees up front, and set your terms and conditions, not get confrontational about it.
Yeah, exactly.
But just having an adult conversation. Here's what happens.
Well, I loved your bit there of, like, this is the fee. Can you afford it? Now, I don't mind if you can't. And that's the other bit that I learned through recruitment, is that there's an infectious, like, I almost want to say it's like a disease. I call it hopeism, and hopeism is like destroys businesses. It's like, oh, if I lower the fee, I hope they go with me, and it's like, and I think, like, hope really can destroy it, especially in pitches, because you then start being subservient to the point. Whereas, for instance, what I've learned, which is a mad idea now, but what I try to do is, when I talk about things in recruitment, I actually am looking to disqualify people, which sounds mad. I'm looking for the no. But then what actually happens is that I've learned that yeses are a byproduct of that, and that you get clients from it. So it's bizarre. It's like, look, this is my fee. This is the price. You go through all those things. You're looking for the disqualification, and it makes a lot of difference. I'll tell you, years ago, one recruitment meeting I went for, and it was a company, and they're a good company. We were talking purely about, they didn't know who I am, and they were like, right, Steve, okay, you snuck in the back door. Okay, you snuck in the back door because I met this guy out. It's like, okay, we might want to get you to work on the BIM coordinator role. I'm like, right, okay, fantastic. We'll talk about it now. And then the HR lady was like, but before we do that, we're going to talk about the fees. And so, and as I told you in my podcast, it's like architecture recruitment fee is typically between 15 to 20%, right?
Yeah.
And she was like, this lady was like, I work with another recruitment company at 12%. And I was like, okay, no problem. And she was like, can you work at 12%? I was like, I can work at 12%. However, I normally work at 20%. So what we can do is, I'll tell you my range of services, and we can agree what we're cutting out. Yeah, right. Exactly. But it was really exciting before, and in my head I was like, okay, I'm being okay. Meeting people in person, that's got to go. Oh, we need you to meet every candidate. I was like, well, that requires an hour of my time. So I can't do that. That's gone. Okay. reference check on. No, we really need. Well, get 20 minutes time, and that's got to go. And by the end of it, fee because why is that wanted the job done properly. But I think what was interesting, and it wasn't her fault, but if recruitment consultants have named the process and have gone, yeah, we'll do 12%, then recruitment is doing the same thing of what architects have done, as in terms of negotiating, not talking about the service, and then and then by nature of it, and then going lower, you cheapen it. You cheapen you because how do they understand what I do? And so it wasn't the client's fault, but the moment for me in terms of negotiation. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Yeah,
all right.
no,
On that point,
absolutely. That's great. If people are pushing you down on fees, then you've got to reduce the scope.
no, I hear you.
Reduce the scope, or what else can you give me that's of equal value to me rather than money?
I think you're right. Well, we're at the half an hour point, and I good is maybe could put a bit of music on while we read out some stuff in the audience. So I've got really music, Rion, but what kind of are you feeling like? Holiday mode? That might be nice because we're all like a bit tired from we haven't been on a holiday. Actually, it's not working. So I've got. What have I got else? What's making noises? Where I was going for, but I got Vikings there. What we'll do. Oh, that's haunted house background. Right. Music. We're gonna read out some of the comments here. Tim, first of all, said in software development, they use the description of architect very liberally, and that I really can see that. I think that can affect things. I'm an architect, and I wish I could be called an architect, but ARB will sue me. On that note of all politics and the old
just put another word in front of the word architect, Stephen, and then you'll get away with it.
Yeah, I'm a design architect. Does that work? Ex-architect. That's what I can be. There you go. Jason is
not an architect.
Yes, that's the best one. I am not an architect. B don't come for me. There you go. That rhyme. Jason's on Clubhouse. Yeah, sounds like a good conversation tonight. Be there at B Square at 7 o'clock. And Jason quite rightly says, this happens to me all the time. People want things for free. Yeah. I when people ask for free stuff, it's never malicious. I think it's you need to constantly show people understand the value. So, for instance, an hour of my time, if you want, I don't know if you've ever paid for a lawyer, and it's a good thing, as you said before, like a solicitor, you pay up front and you pay a lot for that conversation. They'll take $1,000 and they'll prepare. You got to send them the documentation. And if you waffle too much in it, then it's going to charge you more because it's longer to read. And then for that hour conversation, it's timed. And if you go over on it, they'll go, oh, we kind of went over a bit, so you need to pay us for the next chunk, right? Totally different world, and everyone respects the solicitor. So completely agree with your point there, Rion, saying that you will not catch a solicitor doing pro bono work. I'm going to read out Stephanie's point.
Well, they will do pro bono work, but they won't do like work for free with a client where they could be charging.
Yeah, maybe. Hamza's saying my internet's playing up, Rion. That's a nightmare, isn't it?
It is a little bit glitchy, but we can live with it.
We can live with it. Am I glitching out? It's the Matrix. It might be that LinkedIn wants to take me down. Damn it.
This Chinese company that's trying to stop you.
Yeah, I know. I'm getting all the people chasing me on you. That's on YouTube though, Rion. So Stephanie says this is fantastic. Thank you both. You're giving a lot of free works through podcasts. I'm interested in your thoughts. Best way of dealing with challenging clients. And in the case that the team has done a lot of design work, but the client refuses to pay or even sign off design stages. Well, that's a tough one. There's a bits and bobs of what we said before. Rion, I'm passing the ball to you for two reasons. One, my internet might be glitching out. But two, do you have any thoughts on that? Or I can share mine.
Yes, yes. So dealing with challenging clients where the team's done already a lot of design work and the client is refusing to pay. Well, first thing is stop work,
Yeah.
right? So this is something that we do a lot with clients is dealing with unpaid invoices,
Yeah.
and this can be brutal. I mean, the stuff I've heard, Stephen. I
The
was
stuff
thinking
you've heard.
the
Go
stuff
on.
I've heard, the things people have told me. My goodness, I was chatting to one person last year, and they were telling me this was a company that was turning over around £600,000, and it was close to £250,000 of unpaid fees.
Right.
Right,
Gosh.
that is that is super serious stuff when it's happening. And so when a client is, they're not paying, the first thing to do is you're going to have to stop. You're going to have to stop the work. You're
Yeah.
going to have to stop doing any work with them. And sometimes you'll get developers, they're not paying you, and they assume that you're in a paid when paid contract. Okay, so a lot of these problems that happen as a result of the way that the contracts have been set up in the first place, and as a result of a lack of negotiation up front and negotiating face to face and having a conversation at the beginning about unpaid fees, right? So I'll
Right.
often do a thing with clients where you can bring it up in the first conversations about one of the biggest issues in our industry is late paid invoices. How are we going to avoid that happening? I'm sure it's not going to happen with you. You seem like great people, but how do you normally deal with it with your other consultants that you pay, that you make sure that they're getting paid on time? What would happen if you don't get paid from your investors or whoever? Would that have an impact on us? I'm going to tell you now that we don't work on a paid when paid contract, right? Now, say you get through all that, and that you do that, and I'm talking about having this conversation in the sales process, right? Now, let's say that you actually sign the contract. How often do you have a kind of kickoff meeting where you go through in a gracious and friendly and warm manner? This doesn't need to be confrontational, right, or adversarial, but actually starting off the contract with a new client, like as part of your onboarding system. Here are the 7 ideal qualities that make a fantastic relationship between myself as the architect and you as the client. And you could have number 1, you must realize you're going to be making a lot of decisions. The decisions that you make, they are going to impact the overall budget and the cost of the process. Okay.
Yeah.
Number 2, and then somewhere in there, then you can say being paid on time, and you just have an upfront conversation about it yet again, right? So we manage our fees. We have a commencement fee. 50% of that fee is paid up front at the beginning of each stage. We hold on to that, and then we bill either monthly on every month, and we're billed by hourly rates or however you set your billing up, or you bill at the end of milestones, right? And then you remind the client, look, if something happens and you can't pay us, get in contact with us. We're not adversarial. We're not going to get into a fight about it. But if there's a problem and you can't make the payment for some reason, we need to be in communication, right? If invoices go out, unpaid, and they goes beyond our time of 7 days or 30 days, I always recommend have as short as time possible. I don't know why people have 30-day invoice period on architecture projects which are already taking months and months and months. That's ludicrous. But if that time expires and we still haven't got paid, we will stop work. And I just remind you that in our contract we have we set the interest rates according with the Bank of England. And if we don't, and if that happens and the client is still not paying, you can go through a process of increasingly stern letters, and then you've got to be prepared to take legal action.
Well
Right,
said.
that's it. You've taken to a small claim court. I've got a client at the moment who, and this is in the US. They have taken their client to court, the small claims court. The client didn't show up for the meeting, and it was for like a restaurant or something. And they tried to, pay in croissants or whatever, and my client said absolutely no way. But they've taken them to court, over this. They didn't show up for their small claims thing, so that meant that the architect immediately won. And in the US, you've got a process whereby once you've won that, you can then go to the bank of the person who owes you money, and you now have a legal piece of documentation that can order the bank to take the money straight from the client's bank account and into yours.
Wow.
So
There you go.
So you want to be prepared to, hold your ground here when clients are not paying. And one of the first things to do is absolutely, stop work. Okay, that's one of your leverages. How you're structuring your milestones as well. Like, you want to be sending out your fees before you make submissions. So if a client is not paying you, well, sorry, we're not going to submit the planning drawings. We're not going to release them yet. We need to get the fees first, right? And also be protecting your fees all the way through. So by taking chunks of money up front, and again, you negotiate that right at the beginning. You have those objection conversations up front. You've got to be prepared to have a professional adult, but it might be an uncomfortable conversation, but up front. It's much, much easier to do it then than to do it halfway through. And then that starts to mitigate the risk of this happening, right? Because there's always going to be, people having problems. And again, if you've got a client and they're having cash flow problems, and they come to you and they say, Stephen, we're so sorry. We appreciate that we're late with the payments here. We're not sure what we can do. Okay, that's the beginning of a conversation. And, if you're in a solid cash flow position, you can come up with another agreement.
I think that's well said.
And you can say, okay, I understand. Do you know when can we work together for a new date, right? So you want to get them to commit to a new timeline, right? Let's say they say, okay, we guarantee we can get it to you in 6 weeks' time. Okay, great. If we allow you to do that, could you do this and this and this for us, right? I noticed that you're connected with such and such a person. Would you be able to give us, an introduction to that person? Could you bring us a referral? So again, these are all points where you can negotiate something else into it. If they're gonna be late, they're in communication with you. That's fine. Happy to do that. I'd like you to do something for us if we're gonna wait for your payment. We'd like you to introduce. We'd want you to introduce us to this person or bring us a referral of a new project, whatever.
Amazing. I tell you what, my internet will have to keep glitching out because it ends up, Rion, you giving all these gems and nuggets. I feel like I'm sitting here going, oh, my internet's played out. But, I think I couldn't offer the architecture gems that you could on that front. However, in terms of recruitment, you're right. The first thing I do when a client hasn't paid is I stop recruiting.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a bit scary because on one end of the scale, I'm thinking, oh no, I could be losing future work. But you have to stop them from the situation carrying on, because I'm sure the temptation is when you're working with other companies, it's never malicious, but they're like, oh, we'll deal with that later. And cash flow is key in business. And you do have to start, you do have to get the money in. Otherwise, it causes massive problems.
Yeah, absolutely. It's your responsibility to your team, to the design, to your clients, to other clients, that you've got to keep your cash flow healthy. And I often hear architects say to me, oh, but I don't want to rock the boat with the client. What are you talking about? Don't want to rock the boat. The clients already rock the boat so seriously by not paying you. They've rocked the boat. They've messed up here. Yeah. Now you've got to hold them accountable.
Yeah, fair enough.
Right,
I tell you what. No, I can keep those forwards. However, a star in the audience, the Mr. YouTuber Hamza, has another question. Says, great chat, guys. Well, it's Rion's doing all the work here because my internet's playing up because my dial-up's not working. With all your collective experience, could you allude to why there seems to be an architect crisis right now, as described by the media? Is it Brexit, COVID related? And what does that mean for business long term? Now,
so is this referring to the shortage of architects?
That's what I was thinking of. If it is, Hamza, me and were having a bit of a conversation about it earlier. Now, I think, and this is what I was saying to Rion, it's twofold why there's a shortage of architectural professionals. One, it's Brexit. Okay, now if you voted for it or not in the audience, that's your prerogative. I'm just saying to you, as the weatherman here, with my finger in the air, ooh, it's really catching up with us, because what's happening is that now Brexit's made it difficult and unwelcoming, and that's feedback that I do hear from a lot of architects to practice in the UK. So there's going to be less European architects, full stop. The other thing is you've got the pandemic, and because we're not going around with our masks everywhere and we're little rebels within the world, within the UK, that means that the border is shut. And you will find companies like Australia and New Zealand, in my opinion, because the borders are shut, then we miss out on all them Australian architects. We miss out on all those New Zealand architects as well. So, Rion, hopefully you could hear me properly there and I didn't cut out enough. Was the internet okay?
All loud and clear, solid.
Yeah,
solid, crystal
there you
sharp.
go. Right when I say the controversial stuff, like, anyone that voted for Brexit, look what you've done. I didn't say that, but you might want to have a think about hard, fast what's happened. Okay. So Hamza, sorry I missed it. Don't worry, you can watch the recap of this afterwards on YouTube, and you can check it out. Now, Tim actually says, "Have you ever done?"
Just on that, this architect on the architect crisis, because it's interesting. You know, what the experience is, and I think there's other things here as play as well. So in fact the majority of the clients that I work with tend to be in the US.
Yep. And
they're also experiencing this, I've dubbed it the great staff shortage of 2021. And there is particularly in the residential sector, there is a huge boom that's happening because of COVID, and people are starting to reevaluate how they want to live and how they work. And this collectively has meant a huge amount of work that's happened. And then architects have now kind of taken on loads of work very, very quickly. They, number one, again, they typically do not have any hiring processes in place. As you sure must know this, Stephen, that it's, most architects are not active. Like they either do nothing, or they're depending on CVs just coming in. But hiring is like another form of marketing, and often they're not doing anything like that, right? And so they don't have like a pipeline, if you like, of people that they've been cultivating, or new staff happening. So when they suddenly take on a load of new work, then it's very reactive. It's happened very quickly, and then everyone's doing it all at the same time. And now we've got a bottleneck shortage of staff. The other thing is, like in the, just from perspective in the US, they don't have Brexit happening there. But they are experiencing, obviously having lockdown borders, no international people coming in. But you've got problems in, different states where, you can't get, if you're based in Montana, you can't get architects coming from LA or New York to come to, there is just a physical shortage of people here. We're very sparsely populated. And there's also this gulf of what happens, because there's enough architecture students. And what you're seeing in the US particularly is like, students coming out of university, and they're now commanding ridiculous salaries, like really high salaries, 75, 80,000 to 120,000 as new starters. Sometimes, and this is causing all problems in the businesses, because you're getting students who've got zero experience coming into offices now getting paid more than other architects. It's causing tensions in the practices. As soon as the boom dissipates, or it just restabilizes like it will, then those are going to be the first people to lose their jobs. And the other kind of specifics of the shortage is that there's a lot of architects without the right type of experience and skill sets, which is also starting to point a little bit towards, well, what's happening at university. Now, I'm not saying that university should be a place where I don't think the function of architectural education is the place to be, kind of making ready-made architects, but the industry does require somewhere to be doing that. Yeah. Right. Because and again, that's why things like the apprenticeship scheme are so brilliant, because then because then we can have more people going straight into industry. You do not need 7 years of education to be a part 2. You don't.
Yeah.
Like what you end up doing as a part 2 in an office, what I mean, right? Those 5 years of education are brilliant in and of themselves for the joy of learning about architecture and thinking about design. And actually, there's a lot more, I'm seeing more and more architects move into the world of like UX design or software. Now, there isn't a structured path from architecture design into other industries, but my God, you want to take that 100,000 investment you just made into your education. You want to think whether going into architecture is the best place to use that, right? Because there are other industries who will lap up the skill sets of the architect. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be straightforward, but there's a huge amount of potential there. And I'm enjoying speaking to people who have moved and been very creative with their career paths and taken an unstructured route into something different, and are being incredibly well remunerated for it. They're able to be expressive and creative and have an impact on the city and the urban environment, but not being architectural designers. And again, and for the industry, right, actually being trained in the core competencies of an architect, right, learning about building science, learning about how things are actually put together, construction logic. That's really valuable right now. That's a really valuable skill set. So knowing that sort of stuff means that your fees go up, your wages go up, you're worth more to the industry.
Yeah.
So there is a kind of basic supply and demand equation happening, and so it's very interesting. It's very interesting. I do think the architecture education is in a very interesting point to kind of get really super refined and nuanced, and there are lots of new pathways coming forward, and architects, and I think certainly my own architectural education, the tutors were very supportive and interested in you taking a divergent pathway, doing something different, and it's very valuable. And again, the more that we integrate the conversation of business and entrepreneurship into education, that makes the dangers of the risk of the unstructured path into a different industry a little bit more palatable, right? Because now you're thinking like a business person. Now you're thinking about how can I bring value to other people? What sorts of services can I create out of my skill sets? And we're not driven purely by the kind of studio model where I'm designing a project for me because that's what I'm interested in.
Well said.
Right. So that's again that's a mindset shift, but it's very interesting. We're in a good place.
Well, amazing. I want to give you one of my virtual round of applauses for that. That was brilliant. Because it's true, I kind of fell into sales, and the reason I did was because I didn't want to do my part 3, and I didn't really know another route. And I'm a talkative person, so someone was like, "Oh, you think you should do sales?" But it was like going from what's the expression? It's like out of the frying pan into the fire. It's like, okay, now I don't have to do my part 3, but now I've got to call people and make sales. Hey, hiya, can I interest you in a bunch of Revit architects? Because in 2014 that was the thing. So it was like trading one evil for another. But it's done me all right in the end. It's done me all right in the end, and that's where I'm fortunate that I've chosen to be within architecture without doing what I didn't want, and I didn't have a passionate for the technical detail, and I get to meet people like you. So it's worked out for me. But for anyone in the audience, and hopefully I'm not glitching, but I do see people going into UX design. One of my best mates went into it, who studied in part 1, but it was his own initiative. It was his own going out there and coding and doing those things that you do not learn in architecture school. But one thing he always told me is that he's super valued because they love the way he thinks as a designer, and that was taught in architecture. So I do think that even the way I design the architecture social and the way I look at business, all that DNA comes from doing my part 1 and part 2. So I don't regret it. But yeah, you don't have to do the part 1, part 2, part 3. But I am sympathetic for people that actually do not do it, because the initial reaction when I told people I'm not going to do my part 3 is they're like, "Are you okay? What's wrong in your heads? You know, like, why do you not want to do your part 3?" I remember actually, my mum was a bit like that. She was a bit like, "Really? You don't want to be an architect?" Done 5 years, but actually, it was my dad who was okay with it, and he was like, "Yeah, I totally get it." And I went, "Wow, you were so understanding, and you could be really critical because you supported me there." And but he was like, "Yeah, I was a tool man, and I hated it. And every day when I was a tool man, I hated it. And now he does something that he loves. And so even
Amazing.
though, yeah, and that was his humbleness to realize, like, even though I've invested time and he supported me, that maybe I didn't want to do it, and it's led to good things. So, but the irony is that if I didn't do architecture, I wouldn't be here, and so that's why I'm still thankful for it. And it's like you have your architecture practice, but Rian, you do a lot of business consulting, and that makes sense. But it's your experience in practice of speaking to people, which is why that's really valuable. So it's never a waste. So anyone here, you should apply your architecture in whatever way, shape, or form. I always think of like the Matrix architect. You can be whatever architect you want. You don't need to be on ARB's register. But I sound like I'm ARB bashing, but I'm not. I'm just saying.
Absolutely right. The architectural education in itself, and the power of thinking like an architect, and the power that we get for being able to deal with complexity and problem solving, and being able to deal with situations where there is no clear answer. That's and the fact that it's one of the few disciplines which focuses on being a deep generalist, right? So that you've got to be able, and that you're able to think about things in very minute detail, to then being able to understand them in a kind of a more complex context. Those are very, very valuable thinking skills that can be applied all over the place. So I think architecture has got so much value in like that. University, tuition tutors know that as well. And it's just kind of making more pronounced pathways of, I wouldn't be disappointed they started splitting the degrees up, and, you had architectural thinking as a degree. And then if you want to be a practicing architect, then there's a different pathway, which is, called where you get your license to practice type of thing.
I agree.
And then you can become qualified in many different ways, and you don't even need to be at university. There's nothing wrong with, being, I think, getting trained as an architect through an apprenticeship, and you're not in university at all, and you're solely learning it in good practices, right? And practices who are committed to education, and they see that as part of their own responsibility and part of their business culture. Then you can get a very rich and more accessible profession.
Yeah, I agree. And just to add on that, do you know what's mad? Some of the less quote unquote professional, less quote unquote places, while I think it's really good to know where you want to be and looked after, sometimes I look at some bad experiences in terms of employment as good lessons how not to be done. And that's why I think if you're in a bad situation, remember you can always get out of it, and you should always aim to get out of it. But ironically, sometimes a disorganized or a bad situation or a tough deadline can be a really great experience. The trick, though, is not to repeat that and to look for something that doesn't do that. But I remember I had a very difficult manager many years ago, and at the time I thought he was quite unreasonable. But I look back and I could see the pressure he was under.
Yes,
and it was squashed fees, and unfortunately his behavior didn't come out in the best way towards me. But then I look back and perhaps I was not the right person to help him, or perhaps I was not. The situation was difficult, and I do think that actually. Hindsight is a great thing, but again, the fees kind of do squash everything down. So, Jason, what are you randomly saying here? I remember when Rion came to my house to interview me. It was a great evening. I'm sure it was, but I love it. Right.
Jason's got a really, really beautiful home up in up north of Manchester.
I know
Lancashire.
He's got it was in like the local newspaper, Rion, you
It's really
know.
nice. I drove up there and interviewed him in his front room.
Did you? Did you? Oh, I think I've seen that. That was when you talked. It was the first podcast, wasn't it? In business architecture, where was that right? Where you talked about Jason's role, responsibilities.
Yes. Yeah, it was the first time I interviewed Jason.
Yeah. Well, see, that's difficult because you have to hardwire all this stuff. But if you see me looking at my phone here, there's two reasons for that, Rian. And it's not because I wasn't listening to you. It's because doing it, Mr. Oliver Lowry called me, and I said, I'll call you back after my live stream, because that's the one downside of lives, you know. And the other thing is, I worked out why my internet is glitching a bit, and I think
You're downloading something sketchy.
my computer in the living room is downloading something, and I can't go now. So this is the downside of non-physical podcasting. There we go, Jason. Do you see? There you go. Right. Okay, Rion, we've had a cracking hour here. Okay.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
No, we've had a cracking time, and I'm going to put all your links up. You're an absolute star of a guest, putting up with my internet, putting up with my questions, putting up with my rants. You can check out Rion's architecture practice here. As you can also check out the Business of Architecture, which has the podcast, which is super, super cool. And you can hear Rion speak to lots of people, lots of very important people from the industry.
I'll do a little plug here, right? So there are actually two podcasts that I host. So I put out 2 podcasts a week, right?
Do you?
I do. One is the
Let's
Business
see
of
the other one.
So one is the Business of Architecture UK.
Yeah. I'm going to get that link. That's what I'm typing. I'm not listening.
The website Business of Architecture UK, unfortunately, recently just got hacked. And so it's down. It's down at the moment, but you can hear it on Spotify and iTunes and all that kind of stuff. Like Business of Architecture UK.
What about this one?
And then Business of Architecture, that is me interviewing typically US clients or US-based architects.
I found a little hidden gem here, Rion. Archie Travels.
No, take this down.
Oh God, I listen to it now.
No.
Look how and do you know what? This is like antidote for the coronavirus.
This was
We're taking it down.
May 2018. I'm going to scroll down. That's old. There's loads
which is the other
for me floating around from 2014 and earlier where I'm
I think they look good. I think you're being harsh on yourself now, Rion. You know,
they were these little rambles that I used to go on.
I think it looks good.
There used to be there's an app called Anchor, and when Anchor first started in about 2015, and it was basically like an audio version of Twitter. So you would say like a little minute talk, and then other people would comment on it and give you feedback or make comments, and you can have these little conversations on Anchor. And it was really good actually, kind of like a little bit like Clubhouse but not as free streaming.
Okay.
And about 2015 I got obsessed with this app and was making loads of these little narratives as I was wandering around New York City or wherever it was I was traveling.
Fair enough.
And that's where that grew from.
Well, I think it's amazing, and you've got all these super professional guests. You've interviewed people from Squires. You've somehow wangled me on the list, which I appreciate.
Absolutely, look at that.
There you go.
Recruitment with Stephen Drew.
There you go, mate. It's all kicking off, but it's actually that was you're the one podcast where I then went back into the office the next week, and everyone in Acrid Lowry had seen me on there, and they're like, "Is that you?" And I'm like, "I know. I don't know how I snuck in, but it was a fun ride." So you've made me famous, Rion. You've been an absolute star. I'm going to end the podcast here and turn off my computer in the living room from downloading. But you can check out Rion, Business Architecture, and you can message him on LinkedIn. He's on LinkedIn, and check out his podcast. And maybe we'll see you again next time when I get fiber internet, Rion. You know?
Love it. I love it. Anytime, Stephen.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for it being in the audience. And I should play some music on the way out. So what kind of music should we fancy? Should I get some like retro music. We'll do Game
Yeah.
Over.
Yeah, some like 90s hard rock.
90s hard rock. I've actually got something like that.
That's retro nowadays, isn't it?
I've got something like that. I've got like something here for that. Here we go. Inferno. What you want? Hard rock. Oh, that's fun. There you go. We'll leave it there.
Brilliant.
There you go. See you later, guys. Take care.